It's been estimated that embedded in the very fabric of this church behind me are between 5 and 7 kilograms of diamonds. Unfortunately, they are completely worthless, but they were formed in what has to be the most terrifying natural disaster I have ever mentioned on this channel.
For this video, I'm in Nördlingen, a historic city in Swabia, a region that straddles the border between Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg. And I will get to the natural disaster and the diamonds, but while we're here, let's briefly talk about the city itself, or as briefly as is possible for a city with over 1100 years of history. If you've never heard of Nördlingen before, pay attention because there will be some clues as to the aforementioned natural disaster. The city was built in a large, flat and very fertile area known as the Nördlinger Ries, but it also happened to be at the intersection of two trade routes, which gave it an excellent start. It quickly became an important centre for trade in its own right, particularly for textiles. Its coat of arms, showing a black eagle on a golden shield, indicates that it was given the status of Free Imperial City, a designation used in the Holy Roman Empire for cities that were directly represented at the Imperial Diet, an official recognition of its importance. Signs of this importance and affluence are visible everywhere. Lots of streets and plazas have names that reveal who lived and worked there or what was sold there. This building had bakers' shops on the ground floor, while the upper floors were used by the wealthy for their parties. The statue, by the way, is of King Frederick II, the ruler who, in 1215, granted Nördlingen its free imperial status. And of course, there is something which every single visitor to the historic quarter has had to pass through.
Nördlingen is the only place in Germany with a largely intact city wall, with a complete chemin de ronde that you can walk all the way around, measuring over 2.5 kilometers in circumference. And what is a chemin de ronde? Well, this.
Basically, it's a walkway from which guards can, for example, shoot at enemies. The wall has 5 gates, most named after the villages they lead to. The Reimlingen Gate, the Deiningen Gate, here's a photo without the scaffolding, the Löpsingen Gate, the Baldingen Gate, and the Hill Gate because it leads to some hills. In addition to that, the upper water tower and the lower water tower guard the places where the little river enters and leaves the city, and there are various other towers and bastions for additional protection. Construction on this wall began in the 14th century to replace an even older wall which had a much smaller circumference. The old wall can still be traced on a street map, but the new wall was made necessary as Nördlingen was, quite simply, growing. And while in the last 150 years or so, most towns and cities at least partially demolished their medieval defences as they were no longer needed and simply got in the way, Nördlingen chose not to. Not everything is 100% intact. The extra structures outside the wall, known as advanced works, have been demolished, and this gap shows where a huge bastion used to be. But you can still do a complete circuit of the chemin de ronde, and you can still see where the moat was. And the interesting thing about the wall is that it's almost circular. I don't have a drone, but here's the next best thing. And before we move on, we should take a closer look at the Löpsingen Gate. The ceiling of the main arch features a guard popping his head out and asking who goes there. This is thought to be a reference to a local legend. In 1440, the Count of Oettingen bribed the guards to leave the Löpsingen Gate unlocked so he and his soldiers could sneak in. But a farmer's wife saw that when a pig rubbed itself on one of the doors, it swung open, so she told her husband, who in turn raised the alarm, and that is how Nördlingen was saved by a pig. The story has been told since the 15th century, but sadly there's no actual evidence for it. Heroic swine aside, the most striking building in Nördlingen is St. George's Church, the tower of which is almost 90 metres high, and it's built from a stone that can be quarried here with a very distinctive mottled grey look. Several other buildings are also built from it, including parts of the City Hall, particularly the Renaissance staircase, which was a later addition. It used to include a small cell where people who were guilty of very minor crimes could be imprisoned and ridiculed, but now there is just this image of a fool where the window used to be.
The local stone is Suevite. The name comes from the Latin word for Swabia, and it's formed when molten rock is compressed together with solid fragments. It does contain diamonds, but disappointingly, there's nothing you can see actually glittering in the light. The diamonds are embedded in the black flecks, and they are tiny. 1 kilo of Suevite contains roughly 1/5 of a gram of diamonds, and even if you could somehow extract them, they're far too small to see unless you have a microscope.
Apparently, though, Suevite is not the best building material there is. It is easy to carve and fire resistant, but it's also porous and doesn't weather well. Towards the end of the 19th century, St. George's spent 10 years being repaired, followed by another 6 years in the 1970s, and now once again. You can see where the original Suevite has been replaced by Schönbrunner sandstone, which should quickly turn grey to match the Suevite. And there's one more piece to the puzzle I'd like to show you, one that the average tourist doesn't get to see.
In terms of human history, one of Nördlingen's darkest chapters came in the late 16th century, when over a period of 8 years, a total of 33 women and 1 man were brought here and executed for the crime of witchcraft. The method of execution was burning, and because at the time there were no trees here, the flames could be seen right across the entire Ries.
Dozens more were accused, but not executed, and 1 woman died in prison. One of the best-known victims was a certain Maria Holl, who, together with her husband, ran an inn that was in this building, although in those days it looked very different as the facade is late 19th century. When she noticed that the torture continued no matter what she said, she withdrew some confessions she had already made and refused to cooperate. Without a confession, she eventually had to be released after being tortured a total of 62 times.
This was not, by the way, driven by the church. The history of the European witch hunts is very long and very complicated, and the church wasn't involved everywhere all of the time. And in this particular case, the church was very much against it. At the time, it took a very simple view. Belief in witchcraft was mere superstition, therefore witchcraft was not real, therefore nobody could be guilty of it.
In fact, even before the executions began, the local pastor gave a sermon denouncing witch hunts. It was the mayor himself, a certain Johannes Pfähringer, who believed that the cool summers and poor harvests of the Little Ice Age had to be the devil's work.
What 16th century witch hunters could not possibly have known is that this hill just outside of Nördlingen and this rock here are the remains of an inner ring.
An inner ring of what, you might ask? Well, if you haven't guessed it yet, here's the giveaway clue.
By the 19th century, when the European Enlightenment was encouraging the use of modern scientific methods, it was determined that the Nördlinger Ries must be some kind of a crater, but scientists were still puzzled as to exactly what caused it. Early theories suggested it must be connected with some kind of volcanic activity, which was a good guess, but the problem was nobody could find a volcano. One scientist did some experiments and determined that the structure of the crater was consistent with a single explosion near its center and suggested water entering a magma chamber and instantly vaporizing. But while his findings were correct, they actually pointed to a different theory.
This is the Ries Crater Museum, which exists because roughly 15 million years ago, an asteroid impacted here, creating the Suevite found in the area as well as many other rocks and formations typical of an impact crater. But before we continue, there's something you really need to know.
Now, at this point you might be thinking, of course, If Nördlingen is built in a crater, it's going to be round. Craters are round and the city fits inside of it. Well, no, that's not the reason the city walls are round. And in fact, the crater is a lot bigger than Nördlingen. I actually had to take the train to walk here to the edge of the crater just to show you the sheer scale of it.
Medieval Nördlingen is round because there was no particular reason to build it any other shape. No hills or cliffs or swamps or anything that had to be built around. But at its widest, it's about 950 meters in diameter. The asteroid was probably about 1,500 meters across, and it left a crater about 25 kilometers wide, which we now call the Nördlinger Ries. Hardly surprising, really. It was travelling at about 70,000 kilometers an hour when it hit, releasing the energy of hundreds of thousands of Hiroshima bombs.
Now, if I'd been standing here at the time of the impact, I most likely would not have had any time at all to enjoy the show. I would certainly have noticed a very bright light, much brighter even than the sun, and that would likely be the last thing I ever consciously saw. The next thing would have been an even brighter light with enough energy to kill me outright, probably before the signals had had time to travel from my eyes to my brain.
The crater is visible to this day. If you stand where I'm standing, you can clearly see the opposite rim in the distance. And that is just the crater itself. Up to 100 kilometers away, animals and plants would have burst into flames. 200 kilometers away, the shockwave would have flattened forests. Pretty much all of southern Germany would have been devastated. At least, that's according to figures that have been widely published. The latest research, though, suggests it might have been even worse, with spontaneous wildfires up to 300 kilometers away and a destructive shockwave reaching 400 kilometers. Either way, a really bad day for Central Europe, with an explosion that would have been audible in Australia. If you're curious about where I'm standing, it began as some rock thrown here by the impact. Soon after, the crater filled with water, which couldn't escape, leaving this tiny island close to the edge. So many minerals were dissolved in the water, it became saltier than the ocean. Some of it bubbled up through the rock here, and with the help of simple life forms living in what were effectively hot springs, calcium carbonate was deposited. In other words, this hill is a massive lump of limescale. Incidentally, in 1970, the crew of the Apollo 14 mission came here as part of their training. They visited 13 quarries in just 3 days, learning how to recognize the kind of rocks they would expect to find on the moon. And that's why the prize exhibit of the Crater Museum is a piece of actual moon rock. The Nördlinger Ries is one of Earth's best preserved and most studied impact craters, but it wasn't until 1960 that it was known to be an impact crater. The realization that the event created an estimated 13 million kilograms of diamonds scattered about the landscape didn't come until the late 1970s. Local farmers apparently had a brief moment of thinking they were now rich, but of course, as I mentioned earlier, no, the diamonds are worthless. That's a shame, because as the Middle Ages came to an end, the 30 Years' War raged, and trade routes changed, Nördlingen's fortunes took a bit of a downturn. That's one reason the historic centre is so well preserved. Although many houses got a bit of a Baroque facelift, development mostly stopped. More recently, Nördlingen was a fairly important railway junction, but even that role has disappeared, and now it's just a stop on a little branch line. Still, the extensive railway yard is now part of a railway museum, which also runs occasional heritage trains. And there's one more very important thing to say about Nördlingen. It's the hometown of the legendary Gerd Müller, who in 1974 scored the winning goal for West Germany against the Netherlands. If you want to pay your respects, this is his childhood home. In short, if your family includes an astrophysicist, a train enthusiast, a historian and a sports fan, you might consider a visit to Nördlingen. A big thank you to the Ries Crater Museum for their help with this video. Nördlingen is situated about 100 kilometers from Stuttgart and Munich and 80 kilometers from Nuremberg. It can be reached by local trains from Munich, Augsburg, Donauwörth and Aalen. Be aware that trains from Munich divide at Donauwörth, so make sure you're sitting in the right section. For those with mobility issues, Nördlingen itself is reasonably accessible with just a few tricky parts. However, the Chemin de Ronde has no disabled access of any kind. At the Crater Museum, most of the exhibits are in German only, but you can borrow tablets for free with interactive English language guides, and the film can be played back in a number of different languages. There's a link to the official website in the video description.
By the 19th century, when the scientific methods had... By the 19th century, when the European... Probably before the signals had enough time to go from...